May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrenders, marking the end of the war in Europe. For millions of German soldiers, the victory of the Allies became a bitter reality, as they were captured and sent to hastily assembled POW camps across Europe. Among them was a young German woman, swept up in the chaos of surrender. As she faced the uncertainty of her captivity, she expected cruelty and harsh treatment from the American soldiers who guarded her. But in the midst of this brutal reality, one American guard stood apart. Instead of the expected harshness, he offered small acts of kindness, extra rations, moments of reassurance, and gestures of humanity. What began as a brief act of survival grew into an unexpected emotional bond, one that would challenge the boundaries of captor and captive. In the most unlikely of places, compassion began to emerge in a world defined by war and hatred. The surrender of Nazi Germany on May 7, 1945, brought a sense of relief to the Allied forces after 6 years of grueling combat. However, the reality of what came next was far more complex. Germany's official capitulation meant that over 10 million German soldiers and civilians were now prisoners of war. These men and women, once the heart of the Nazi war machine, were now in the hands of the very forces they had fought against. The question on the minds of both the Allies and the captured soldiers was simple. How would these prisoners be treated? The Geneva Conventions, which the Allies had signed before the war, were clear. POWs were entitled to basic human rights, including food, shelter, and medical care. The document outlined strict guidelines for the treatment of prisoners and was intended to prevent atrocities from being committed during wartime. The Geneva Conventions also prohibited torture, requiring that POWs be treated with dignity and respect. The document called for POWs to be provided with suitable accommodation, enough food, and regular medical attention, but the practicalities of war complicated this vision. With millions of prisoners, the Allies found themselves overwhelmed. Camps were hastily constructed, many of them lacking adequate facilities to house the massive numbers. Supplies, including food and medicine, were in short supply due to the extensive devastation across Europe. The sheer scale of the problem made full adherence to the Geneva Conventions impossible, leading to overcrowded conditions, inadequate sanitation, and food shortages. While some American soldiers did their best to uphold the ideals of the Geneva Conventions, the realities of war often led to the bending of these rules. While many prisoners expected to be treated as criminals or worse, the reality of their conditions depended largely on the attitudes of the individual soldiers guarding them. Some guards followed their orders strictly, providing food, shelter, and medical care to the prisoners. Others, however, found it difficult to separate the reality of war from the dehumanizing effect that mass captivity had on the prisoners. The result was a complex and often contradictory system of treatment that varied from camp to camp, soldier to soldier, and prisoner to prisoner. For the German prisoners, many of whom had been raised in a world where brutality and fear were part of their daily lives, the end of the war held a strange paradox. Some expected immediate retribution for their role in the war. Others feared being executed or used for forced labor. Yet in some of the POW camps, the unexpected happened. Small acts of kindness from the American guards began to defy the initial expectations of cruelty and hatred. These moments, however fleeting, offered the first glimmer of hope for the prisoners, even as the horrors of war continued to haunt them. Amidst the devastation and uncertainty of post-war Europe, a new reality began to emerge in the POW camps, a reality where simple acts of humanity began to challenge the brutality of war. By June of 1945, millions of German soldiers and civilians were being processed through POW camps across Western Europe. The scale of this operation overwhelmed the American forces tasked with maintaining order, security, and discipline in the camps. The American soldiers, many of whom had fought in brutal battles on the front lines, were now charged with overseeing the very soldiers they had once fought against. In the chaos and confusion of war's aftermath, the guards found themselves facing an unexpected challenge: how to reconcile their roles as captors with their shared humanity. Most of the American soldiers were focused on maintaining order and following their superiors' orders. The Geneva Conventions, which they had been taught to respect, were often seen as an abstract ideal rather than a practical guideline to be implemented under wartime conditions. The reality of their new responsibilities became apparent quickly. Many of the POW camps were overcrowded, and the living conditions were dire. The sheer number of prisoners made it nearly impossible to adhere to every guideline, and many soldiers did their best to maintain the peace in increasingly hostile environments. For some guards, this was a job like any other. They kept their distance from the prisoners and ensured that their duties were performed with a detached professionalism. The rules were clear: maintain order, enforce discipline, and adhere to the military's policies. For others, however, the sight of men, women, and children who had once been the enemy but who were now human beings caught in the same conflict evoked a more complex response. Among the soldiers who guarded the POW camps was a young American man, freshly enlisted and eager to prove himself. He had spent much of the war in Europe and had witnessed the devastation firsthand. He had fought in Normandy, participated in the Battle of the Bulge, and seen countless atrocities. But now, in the POW camps, he found himself facing a different kind of enemy. The prisoners, many of whom had been soldiers just like him, seemed so much like ordinary men caught in the same terrible war. Despite the strict orders given to the soldiers, orders to treat POWs with caution and to keep a strict distance, this particular young soldier couldn't shake the sense that there was more to their situation than just obedience. He began offering small acts of kindness to the prisoners. A piece of extra bread here, a brief conversation there. It was nothing overt, but it was different from what he had been trained to do. His actions stood out to some of the other guards, who saw them as a violation of military protocol. They were uncomfortable with the idea of a guard offering sympathy or help to the very people they had been taught to view as enemies. But the small acts of kindness did not go unnoticed by the prisoners. The young guard's actions became a lifeline for some, a small reminder that even in the midst of war there was still room for compassion. Though the camp's officers would never officially acknowledge the young soldiers' behavior, it was clear to the POWs that there was more to their captors than they had expected. Amidst the rigid military structure, one young soldier's small acts of kindness began to form a connection with the very people he was tasked to control, challenging the assumptions of both captor and captive. The young German woman, caught in the final days of the war, found herself among the millions of prisoners taken by the Allies. She had been caught in the confusion of Germany's surrender, fleeing from the front lines, and now, for the first time, experiencing life as a prisoner. She had heard stories of how the Allies treated their captives, stories that filled her with dread and fear. She expected nothing but cruelty from the American soldiers guarding her. The propaganda she had been exposed to in Germany had painted a picture of a merciless enemy, one who would stop at nothing to break the spirit of the German people. When she arrived at the POW camp in France, her fears seemed justified. The camp was overcrowded, the food was scarce, and the soldiers seemed cold and indifferent. The woman's sense of dread grew as she braced herself for the worst. She had heard of prisoners being worked to death, beaten, and treated without mercy. But what she didn't expect was the soldier who was assigned to watch her camp, the American guard who would change her perception of the war. At first she kept her distance, wary of the soldier's kindness. She had been taught to see him as the enemy, and the idea of receiving help from someone who represented the forces that had destroyed her country was almost too much to process. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The American soldier started to offer small gestures of comfort, extra rations, a reassuring word, and even moments of brief communication in broken German. The woman, though still fearful, found herself drawn to these acts. She had never expected such kindness from an enemy soldier, and at times she wasn't sure how to respond. She had been taught that the Allies were heartless. But this soldier, though still a captive's guard, was treating her as though she were a person. The small moments of connection, an extra piece of bread, a question about her well-being, even a smile, began to break down the walls she had carefully constructed. The woman found herself questioning everything she had been told about the enemy. Could it be that there was more to this American soldier than just his uniform? What began as an act of survival, accepting small gestures of kindness, began to evolve into something much more complex, challenging the woman's beliefs about her captors and the very nature of war itself. By July of 1945, the young German woman had been in captivity for nearly 2 months. The initial fear she had felt upon her capture had not fully faded, but it had begun to recede. Life in the POW camp, though harsh, had become something she could endure. She had found a routine. The long roll calls, the forced labor, the meager rations. The soldiers who guarded the camp were a constant reminder of her captivity. But one soldier stood out. The young American guard, who had first offered her small gestures of kindness, continued to interact with her in ways she could not easily dismiss. It began with the simplest of exchanges. He would occasionally offer her an extra piece of bread or ask if she was feeling well. At first she had been hesitant, unsure whether these acts of kindness were genuine or just an extension of the soldier's duties. But as the days passed, she found herself looking forward to his brief interactions. His broken German, his awkward attempts to communicate with her, were all signs of his discomfort in the role he had been assigned. Still, each act, however small, was a departure from the cruelty she had expected. As she observed him more, She began to notice something unusual. The other soldiers largely ignored the POWs, treating them as mere numbers. The American guard, however, seemed to make a point of looking out for her and a few others. He was not like the others. He was not simply enforcing the rules. He was trying in his own way to make their suffering bearable. His behavior, while not widely acknowledged by his peers, set him apart. To the woman, it became clear that he was not acting from duty alone. There was something more beneath the surface. The woman's internal conflict deepened. She had been taught to despise the Allies, to view them as oppressors who would show no mercy. Yet here was a soldier who had the power to treat her with the same indifference as his peers. But instead, he chose to treat her with humanity. She was unsure of how to react. Should she accept his kindness or should she remain guarded? And suspicious, the tension between expectation and reality became a constant force in the camp. While the woman initially saw the guard as part of the oppressive system, over time, his actions forced her to reconsider her assumptions. She began to see him as more than a symbol of enemy cruelty. He was, in some ways, a fellow human being caught in the same conflict. Though their positions were different, the emotional weight of captivity had affected them both. It wasn't much, but when he shared some bread, it felt like a world of difference in that hell. German POW interview 1946. The relationship between the woman and the guard deepened, evolving from mere survival tactics into something neither of them had expected, a genuine human connection in the midst of war. As the weeks passed into August of 1945, the dynamics in the POW camp began to shift. The emotional distance that had initially defined the interactions between captor and captive began to dissolve. The woman, once wary and fearful of her captors, had found herself in a strange emotional limbo. She was still a prisoner, but the emotional bonds she had formed with the American guard made her feel, for the first time in a long while, as though she had a voice in this silent, oppressive world. The small acts of kindness from the soldier had evolved into more substantial gestures. He would still share his rations with her, but now their conversations had become more personal. He would ask about her family, her life in Germany, and how she was coping with the trauma of captivity. In return, she began to share bits and pieces of her life before the war. She told him of her childhood, her family's struggles, and the disillusionment she had felt as the war tore her world apart. For the first time since her capture, she felt heard. Though the guard remained silent about his own past, it was clear to her that he, too, was processing his own emotions. Despite their efforts to maintain a connection, both the guard and the woman struggled with the tension of their positions. The woman, still a prisoner, knew that her feelings were complicated. She had come to trust this guard, but she couldn't forget that he was still an enemy soldier. She still feared the retribution that could come from any misstep in this delicate balance. For the guard, the emotional weight of their interactions grew heavier. He had entered the camp believing in the righteousness of his role as a soldier. Yet, over time, he had begun to see the prisoners as people, not faceless enemies. His growing attachment to the woman forced him to confront the true complexity of war. He had been taught to see the Germans as the enemy, to treat them with suspicion and disdain. But this woman, this person, challenged everything he had been taught. The emotional evolution of their connection mirrored the evolution of the camp itself. Though the camp remained a place of rigid military structure, the human element could not be fully contained. As the guard and the woman continued to share their stories, the world around them seemed to fade. They had become more than captor and captive. They had become two people caught in the same devastating conflict, finding comfort in each other's presence. It wasn't just food. He shared moments. He talked to me, and in a way, that was more important. German POW Recollection, 1946. The growing emotional bond between the guard and the woman challenged the rigid framework of military regulation, highlighting the complex intersection of duty and humanity. As September of 1945 arrived, the war was officially over, but the complexities of life in the POW camp had only deepened. The bond between the young German woman and the American guard had grown undeniable, but it was also fraught with tension. Both of them were acutely aware of the risks their emotional connection posed. They were trapped in a system that defined them by their roles: the woman, a prisoner; the guard, a soldier. Military regulations, which had been established to maintain discipline and control, strictly prohibited any form of fraternization between prisoners and guards. U.S. Army Regulation 2-20 was clear. Soldiers were to maintain distance from POWs and avoid any actions that could be seen as a breach of military protocol. The guard knew that his behavior was a violation of these regulations, and the woman too was aware of the consequences they both faced if their bond were discovered. But despite the risks, the emotional connection between them continued to grow. The woman, once terrified of her captors, had come to see the guard as a symbol of hope and humanity in a world filled with violence. She had begun to trust him in a way that she had never trusted anyone before. For the first time since her capture, she felt a sense of emotional security. The guard, too, was struggling. He was caught between his duty as a soldier and his growing emotional attachment to the woman. His fellow soldiers had begun to notice his interactions with the prisoners, particularly the woman. They were uncomfortable with the closeness he had developed, and some even warned him to keep his distance. But the soldier could not ignore the bond that had formed between them. As the days passed, the tension surrounding their relationship intensified. The military authorities were tightening their grip on the camps as they began processing the prisoners for repatriation. While many soldiers were focused on the logistics of the post-war world, the young guard found himself focused on one person, the German woman who had changed everything he thought he knew about the enemy. We both knew the consequences if anyone found out, but there was something more between us that couldn't be ignored. American Guard, personal account, 1945. Their emotional bond, though undeniable, was now a source of internal conflict for both the guard and the woman as they were forced to confront the harsh realities of their roles in a world that demanded strict boundaries. As October of 1945 unfolded, the situation at the POW camps began to shift. The war had officially ended months earlier, and the Allies, now victorious, were focused on the repatriation process. The priority was clear: send the prisoners back to their home countries. But within the confines of these camps, life for the POWs had begun to settle into a strange rhythm. Amid the mundane routine of roll calls, labor details, and scarce rations, a bond had formed between an American guard and a German woman, a bond that had not gone unnoticed by the other soldiers. Initially, the guard's kindness had seemed like an isolated incident, a deviation from the usual routine of strict military discipline. But as the weeks went on, his behavior became more obvious to the other soldiers. Some saw it as a clear violation of military rules. Fraternization between guards and POWs was strictly forbidden, a regulation designed to maintain the discipline and separation between captor and captive. Others, however, viewed the guard's actions differently. They saw in his kindness an unexpected manifestation of empathy, a rare glimmer of humanity in an otherwise brutal war. Reports started circulating within the camp about the guard's interactions with the German woman. Some soldiers were uncomfortable with the closeness they shared, while others quietly admired the soldier's ability to break through the hardened barriers of war and offer kindness to the enemy. The complexity of the situation was not lost on the other prisoners either. Many of them had lived through the brutality of the war and expected nothing but cruelty from their captors. Yet, in the midst of captivity, they saw the relationship between the guard and the woman as a stark contrast to the general attitude toward the prisoners. It was an act of defiance, but also of human connection. As more attention turned toward the unusual behavior of the young soldier, the consequences of his actions loomed larger. The camp's commanding officers were not blind to the situation. They had received reports from other guards, and though there were no formal charges brought against the young soldier, it was clear that his actions were beginning to raise questions within the camp. What had initially seemed like a small act of rebellion, offering extra rations or a few minutes of conversation, was now being perceived as a potential threat to military discipline. For the guard, the mounting scrutiny was unsettling. He had not anticipated that his simple gestures of kindness would attract so much attention. He had treated the German woman as a human being because that was how he saw her, someone caught in the same devastating war as himself. But the rules of war, the military hierarchy, and the ever-watchful eyes of his peers forced him to face the reality that his actions could have severe consequences. The bond he had formed with the German woman had become a symbol of rebellion in a world where strict discipline was supposed to reign. What began as a quiet act of rebellion between two people who had been defined by war quickly became a matter of military interest, with the consequences of their connection growing closer with each passing day. By November of 1945, the war had officially ended, and the POW camps were beginning the long process of repatriation. The prisoners were being sent back to their respective countries, their time in captivity coming to an end. The German woman, like the others, was being processed for repatriation to Germany, her home country shattered by defeat. As the soldiers and POWs began to prepare for their respective returns, the emotional toll of separation became undeniable. For the young American guard, the reality of their bond hit with full force. He had known that the end of the war would mean the end of his time in Europe, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply his connection with the German woman had affected him. In the chaotic aftermath of war, they had found a brief moment of humanity. Two people from opposite sides of a brutal conflict forming a bond that transcended the boundaries of captor and captive. Yet now, with the war's conclusion, that bond was coming to an end. The emotional weight of saying goodbye to the woman was palpable. Despite the rules, despite the complexities of their relationship, they had come to rely on each other for emotional support. The guard had shared his past with her, his experiences on the battlefield, and the trauma that had followed him to the POW camp. She in turn had shared her fears and grief over the destruction of her homeland. In a world ravaged by war, they had offered each other a brief moment of solace, yet the reality of their respective roles could not be ignored. The soldier was bound by his duty, his discharge papers arriving as a final reminder of his return to civilian life. The woman, meanwhile, was still a prisoner. Her future was uncertain. Germany was in ruins, and her place in the New World Order was yet to be determined. For both, the end of the war meant the end of their time together. Their emotional connection, however significant, was now destined to remain a memory. The camp authorities were busy processing the final group of POWs, including the German woman. The guard, with his discharge papers in hand, would soon leave the camp and return to the United States. Though the woman had not yet been released, the guard knew that this was the last time they would meet. Their roles in the war had defined them, but the war was over, and so too was their brief connection. As the guard packed his belongings and prepared for his departure, he found himself reflecting on the bond he had formed with the German woman. It was a bond that transcended nationality, military rank, and the brutal realities of war. It was a reminder of the complex nature of humanity, where compassion could flourish even in the darkest of times. Despite the deep emotional connection they shared, the reality of their roles and the end of the war meant that their bond would soon be severed, forcing both to confront the world beyond the confines of captivity. The end of the war meant that both the guard and the woman would have to face the harsh reality of their respective futures. The guard, returning to a civilian life in the United States, was left with the emotional burden of their connection. He had formed a bond with the German woman, one that had defied the military rules and regulations. Yet the end of the war was a final line in the sand. There would be no further contact, no opportunity to explore what they had shared. For the German woman, the future was equally uncertain. Repatriated to a country in ruins, she would have to rebuild her life amidst the remnants of a shattered society. The memories of the American Guard remained with her, a reminder that even in the midst of war, humanity could emerge in the most unlikely places. But as the war ended, so too did their connection, and she would have to navigate a world where her bond with the Guard could not be understood. The total number of POWs repatriated in the months following the end of the war was staggering. In Germany alone, nearly 3 million soldiers were returned to their home country, many of whom had been held captive for several years. For those who had experienced a bond, even fleeting during their captivity, the return to normal life often involved the painful process of reconciling wartime relationships with the realities of post-war life. As the finality of the war settled into their lives, both the guard and the woman were left to confront the consequences of their bond, a connection that had once seemed so simple, yet had grown into something far more complex and irreconcilable. The months following the end of World War II brought major shifts in the lives of those who had been directly involved, particularly the American Guard and the German woman. Both were forced to come to terms with the consequences of their wartime experiences, and their brief connection, once a symbol of shared humanity amidst the horrors of conflict, became a distant memory that neither could easily reconcile with the lives they were expected to lead in post-war society. For the German woman, returning to Germany was a harsh and emotional experience. The once proud country lay in ruins, its cities decimated by the relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The people she returned to were weary and broken, living in a state of profound disillusionment. The war's aftermath left deep psychological scars, and the journey home was filled with both relief and trepidation. While she had been liberated, the world she knew no longer existed. The American Guard, meanwhile, returned to the United States, to a society that was moving forward. The wounds of war were still fresh, but the nation's focus was on rebuilding and recovering from the long years of conflict. The Guard, now back in civilian life, found himself haunted by memories of his time in Europe, memories not only of the battles he fought, but also of the emotional bond he had shared with the German woman. He was encouraged to forget about his wartime experiences and embrace normalcy. Yet, as time passed, he could not erase the memory of the woman who had once been his captive. The war had forced them both to confront their shared humanity, and that connection was something he could not easily dismiss. In the years following the war, both of them would continue their lives, but the scars of the past would linger. They had been defined by their roles in the war, her as the prisoner, him as the soldier. But their brief bond had changed both of them in ways that would last a lifetime. It became clear that, for both, the war's true cost was not just measured in casualties or territory lost. It was measured in the relationships formed, the personal connections made in the most unexpected of places. The passage of time allowed both the Guard and the woman to return to their respective lives, But the emotional consequences of their wartime bond remained, shaping their paths in ways neither could fully understand. In the years following their separation, the emotional cost of the war became ever clearer. For the German woman, rebuilding her life was a constant struggle. Germany was devastated, its people living in a state of collective trauma. Her experiences in the POW camp, though brief, had profoundly shaped her view of the world. She struggled with the complex emotions that came with her captivity. The kindness shown to her by the American guard, despite the fact that he was her captor, was something she couldn't easily forget. But as the years passed, she found it difficult to speak of him or the bond they had shared. She lived in a society that was focused on rebuilding, yet her personal memories of the war were tangled with confusion and sorrow. The relationship she had formed with the guard was one of the few moments of light in a dark period, yet it was something she could never fully reconcile with the harsh reality of the world around her. For the American guard, the war's aftermath was no less complicated. Although he had returned to his family and resumed a normal life, the memories of his time in Europe haunted him. He had fought in some of the war's most brutal battles and had seen things that were impossible to forget. But it was his bond with the German woman that stayed with him the longest. She had been a prisoner, yet she had been the first to see him not as a soldier, but as a person. She had trusted him when she had no reason to, and though their bond was brief, it was profound. The guard often found himself wondering what had happened to her, whether she had survived the ravages of post-war Germany, and whether she ever thought of him as he thought of her. In the years after the war, the guard and the woman never met again. Their paths, once briefly intertwined, had diverged into different lives, yet both carried with them the emotional weight of their experiences. The war, with all its destruction, had shaped them in ways they could not have anticipated. The kindness that had transcended the boundaries of their roles, captor and captive, had been a rare moment of humanity in a world defined by violence and division. And though they were now separated by distance, time, and circumstance, the emotional impact of their bond would stay with them forever. Despite the passage of time, the emotional scars of war continued to define both the guard and the woman, a reminder that some connections transcend even the most difficult of circumstances. As the years went by, both the American guard and the German woman moved forward with their lives. Yet their wartime connection remained a quiet but significant part of their personal histories. For the guard, the emotional impact of the war lingered long after he had returned to civilian life. The memories of the German woman, the kindness they had shared in the POW camp, and the profound bond that had developed in a time of unimaginable hardship never left him. The psychological scars of war, like those of the woman, were invisible to others, but they shaped his daily existence in ways that were hard to explain. He had married, had children, and led a full life, yet the past, particularly his experiences during the war, never truly left him. The woman had become a symbol of the complexities of human nature. The bond that had formed between them was something he could never fully explain, nor could he ever forget. For the woman, the aftermath of the war was one of rebuilding. Her country was shattered, and the memories of her captivity were mixed with the sadness of a defeated nation. But the bond she had shared with the guard, however fleeting, remained a part of her. It was a moment of humanity that had emerged in a world of cruelty. While she had seen much suffering, the kindness of the American soldier was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, the potential for empathy and connection existed. She often wondered what had become of him, whether he had found peace in his life, whether he had forgotten her, or whether he ever thought of the woman he had once treated with unexpected kindness. As time passed, the emotional toll of the war continued to shape both of their lives. Though the conflict had ended, the psychological scars remained. The war had been a time of unimaginable loss and destruction, but it had also been a time of unexpected connections. The bond between the woman and the guard, though brief, was a symbol of the complexity of human nature in times of conflict. It was a reminder that even in the most divided and brutal of times, compassion and empathy could still emerge. The emotional legacy of the war was something that both the guard and the woman carried with them until their final days. Though they never met again, the memory of their connection was something they both treasured. In a world torn apart by conflict, their bond was a rare moment of peace. In the end, the legacy of their bond was not defined by its brevity or its impossibility, but by the simple fact that, in the midst of war, two people had found a way to connect, to see each other as human rather than enemy. The story of the American guard and the German woman is one that transcends the boundaries of nationality, military rank, and the brutal realities of war. Though the war officially ended in May of 1945, its emotional impact continued to reverberate through the lives of those who had lived through it. The bond formed between captor and captive, though brief and ultimately doomed to end, remains a powerful symbol of humanity's capacity for empathy and connection, even in the darkest of times. In the years following the war, the American Guard and the German woman returned to their respective lives. Their connection, however fleeting, became a lasting memory, one that transcended the roles they had been given during the conflict. It was a reminder that even amidst the destruction and brutality of war, the human spirit could find a way to break through. They were two individuals caught in the same terrible conflict who found something meaningful in each other amidst the chaos. As time moved forward and the world healed, their story remained a testament to the complexities of war and the unexpected connections it could foster. The legacy of their bond became more than just a memory. It was a reminder that in even the most divided times, compassion could emerge, transcending the lines that society had drawn between them.